creation of local vigilante groups. I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open up this debate. Here.
Give me a second to organize my notes. POIs verbally, please. Okay. Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2. Wait, give me a second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In a society where we need to change things, we need to change the narratives, especially where things are still not being changed. We say that vigilantism is the best way to opt in. So, what's the status quo in today's debate? We say that the vigilantism will only be able to materialize in areas where there's high crime high crime, or where governments are corrupt. They have to materialize there because in order for vigilantism to be supported through a lot of people, it has to be in areas where they have a reason. They have to be in a society where their voices aren't being heard, the governments are being corrupt, and they're not giving them a way to protect themselves or a way to fight against this crime. There will also be systemic racism in these societies because it's the root cause of why people want to opt into crime, because they feel as they that's the only way for them to get out of poverty or to get out of things like being in a difficult situation. Now, moving on to some key characterizations. So these vigilantes usually will only opt into vigilantism for a reason. It could be characterized as something that affects them. For example, social movements like George Floyd, or a family member being killed by these crime rates. They feel as if they need to do something to change their society. They need to set a role model. And how the police force will be affected in this is that they will be wanting to stop these vigilantism groups. They want to stop these protests. They stop things from keep things from going out of hand. So we say that they will play a major part in this today's debate. So our goal on side government is that we want to prove how vigilantism will proc change or proc state obligation to be able to stop all these criminals. And I think the burden that we have to prove is that why the radical approach far outweighs the Fabian approach. So now moving on to my main arguments, we need a radical approach when the country, where the states where vigilantes are so corrupt and bad. For example, Detroit and Atlanta, right? Crime rate is extremely high, and the police force is unable to do things to stop against these criminals, because when the police force has to deal with crime happening every single day, happening in different areas, it just leads to a understaffing of people in the justice system. People are unable to go and help out all these areas, and it just leads to a lot more crime for these groups, especially in where the states are so, as in so far where these states are so in such poverty, right? It's usually stemmed from having an incompetent state. And Detroit is unable to take matters into their own hands. The state government are unable to take matters into their own hands because they're characterized as corrupt, right? Or they don't really have that much as an incentive to actually opt into giving the obligation towards these states. No, thank you. Towards these states. So when we need to reform a society, we need to be able to hold this state accountable. And we say the best way to do so is through vigilance. So what happens when we opt into vigilantism? Two things. We say that vigilantes will usually go towards these criminal groups and take matters into their own hands. We have to concede the fact that it will obviously be violent, and we say that it would. And second, we say that it would lead to having the state be accountable, because people will be having vigilantism protests, and more violence will occur from this, and the state obviously has an obligation to stop this. So why is it so important? It makes the state need to care about this stuff, and it leads to the police needing to stop these vigilantism groups and letting their voice be heard. So even if these criminals are, even if the vigilante groups are bringing away like focus from the criminals, we say that it's still good, because these vigilantes groups will be posted on social media. They will be advertised throughout news, and even if it's negative discourse, we say that negative discourse is still discourse, right? Conversations will be talked about the state and what their jobs are. There will be conversations about how obliged the state is, and it could even lead to being a change of government. So why does this far outweigh the Fabian approach? In a society like Detroit, where the governments have all the power, no one moving around to try to stop it, the cycle will continue over and over again, leading to things that harm people in the future. For example, when you have such high crime rates, one of these things could stem from school shootings. The best way in the school shootings, which ultimately harm the children. The best way to move out of being a poverty state is through education and fostering children. So when we have a culture, when we have such systemic racism, where these children are opted to believe that if forever they will forever be impoverished, there is no way there's no role model for them. We said that we need this vigilantism approach to set a role model for them, to get the police officers to do something about this, to keep a protected society. So when we use a radical approach, it forces people to have a nice role image. It forces these people to like get the police officers to do things. Note that sure it'll be dangerous, but it'll far outweigh the harms. Why? Combat against these criminals are more. No, thank you. I'll take it at 5:30. As more state obligation, and you give more deterioration towards these villains, towards these criminals, because like they're like they know there's someone to stop them. They know the state will be more obliged than before that any POIs.
Why is the alternative not to just fund the police even?
Because when we fund the police even more, we've already characterized that the state has already been so corrupt. Like the state obviously has enough money to go and fund these police to stop all these judiciary things. They need to have a voice, right? But they don't, because they're so corrupt. They're so focused on just benefiting themselves, because that's the status quo in states like Atlanta, states like Detroit. So moving on to my second impact, right? When we allow vigilantism, it brings two impacts towards society, and we say that it can change the narrative within society. It leads to people's voices to be heard, and it leads to people wanting to change the narrative. And why is that good on our side of the house? It's because we lead to more people to fight for change. Look at things like the Black Lives Matter movement. Look at things like even in the 1960s, like the Birmingham raids, where people raided the cities, and they created change. They created policies to be changed. When you hold the state accountable, needing to hear voices, you need to stop it. And it would work when everyone opts into a more reformed society. People will be able to drive out these corrupt governments for because people's voices are being heard. Governments will need to oblige towards it, or else it won't stop. Even if it doesn't work, at least our news will be broadcasted, and we people will know what we're trying to fight for. We need to change society. We need to change systemic racism, and that's why you side with Gov. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for that speech, calling on the leader of opposition. Here.
You alright? You alright? You alright? Yeah, if the bribing power of these crime groups are more powerful than state power to reform the police force, how are you going to be able to solve the crime problem on your side?
I think the speaker for that speech, calling on the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Alright, people are just notes. Alright, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Alright. Gotham City, Metropolis, Detroit, Chicago, all in desperate needs of saviors and law enforcers that won't decide to arrest them based on the tone of their skin or the inflection in their voice. When all hell breaks loose, you have to bite the bullet. So beginning my rebuttals, escalation escalation leading to more violence and being bad for us overall. Escalation does lead to more escalation in violence does create more violence, more deaths, but that is actually good in the long term because it creates news and discourse. The Tiananmen Square massacre, the Hong Kong protests were all not mass published by other media until violence happened. So the results created more scrutiny around the authority itself, which then led to authorities having to take in accountability, which proves how side opposition's point in the lack of accountability is actually beneficial towards solving the root cause. We need to hold the state accountable, not the vigilantes themselves, because they are simply a symptom of the larger issue. So then why opposition's argument also fails here is because they have completely disregarded what we have said in our framing. In order for vigilantism to be able to change things is when the legal system has completely failed and there is outside input needed. So speaking about the legal system, forcing people into court, especially into high crime neighborhoods, is also simply infeasible and counterintuitive. Not only are private lawyers and general legal fees expensive and usually not fully covered, looking at PsyOps world where in status quo we have alarming statistics that show a majority of criminal cases, they do result in plea bargains over trials or actual convictions, which also indicates that there is a larger moral gray area where some defendants get away, especially in the previously characterized high crime neighborhoods, usually with less than dignified judges and prosecutors. Ignoring the fact that most minorities are also like, they have a stereotype when they go in with public defenders. So now let me address the arguments brought up by my Prime Minister. Radicalism and extremism inspires change. Time and time again, modern society has set and proven the precedent that an extreme force of greater good, no thank you, brings about actual change and attention. Black Lives Matter, the original civil rights protest, suffragists and suffragettes, even the Boston Tea Party, all these events had some sort of primary martyr or symbol, which is like George Floyd, Martin Luther King Jr., Emily Davidson, etc., that basically serve as an idol to the community itself. So then why is community important towards our argument? The community involvement creates a larger voice that resonates with the rest of society because none of us wants to see violence, but vigilantes create that attention and that discourse in the first place. So it unifies societies against the social problem, which is the larger issue that causes the high crime rates in general. In a twisted way, vigilantes are the figureheads that are signals to higher authorities to take action. So supporting its creation creates public awareness to a symptom of the main disease, which will force the hand of the government as opposed to side opposition's main case, which will instead forego a necessary sacrifice to let crime continue plaguing these areas. In a way, vigilante groups are the high fever to a viral infection. When you try to only treat and curb it, the infection will continue ravaging the body and kill the host, which is in this case the community and their sense of safety. So next, I would also like to target like a POI addressed by my Prime Minister, defunding the giving extra funding to the police. So it is unable to stand in good faith simply because it has also already been attributed to the police contributing to the scenario of status quo presented in the motion. There is a reason why vigilantes groups need to pop up in the first place. That's because there's a lack of police presence, or at least a lack of a trustable police force. So now let me go to weigh our arguments. Supporting vigilante groups will immediately reduce the amount of criminals in a targeted area because the existence of these kinds of forces, usually more brutal than traditional police, intimidates criminal gangs, especially those affiliated with petty crimes, who only get a slap on the wrist in a traditional judicial system. In fact, this is not justifying opposition's case because reducing petty criminals also creates a faster, more immediate effect in the community, which proves that we have a larger magnitude of impact. Break-ins and lootings, also considered petty crimes, are also issues that are proximate to the neighborhoods themselves, considering that most of them have residents that are part of minorities who already rely on welfare like food stamps and goods and services instead of actual cash. So then, the likelihood that supporting the creation of vigilante groups will bring attention and lead to a reduction in general crime of that area is also higher than allowing these areas to continue festering with crime or to expend extra resources into sending in more police who would not be needed if the area was already well monitored or well kept in the first place. So then in terms of time frame, we also are able to win on the weighing of the time frame between the solution and the post-solution world, because not only is the impact delivered faster, it is also more noticeable in the long term. When you have vigilante groups doing the state's job better than them, it is in their best interest to not let them continue due to legal obligations and matters relating to tourism and reputation, all which cripple the economy of that particular area and the city it is in. Therefore, it is proven that states will take more immediate action against vigilantes, thus also acting in community's favor by controlling the situation and reaching the common goal between both houses faster. Before I continue, is there any POI? Okay, the problem of indiscriminate violence is that we have to bite the bullet, because police in this area tend to already not be very morally upstanding. The reason why these areas have high crime in the first place is because they also don't really trust the police. That's why they don't allow the police to intercept or intervene. When police do things like removing body cams, I understand body cams are a way to prevent these crimes, but they do remove their body cams. They do plant drugs into the back of minorities' cars. These have all happened before. You have a disparity between and the disconnect between the trust of the community and the trust in the police. So then the police will stop monitoring and will stop caring, and vigilantes will have to rise up against the common evil. But then when we have vigilantes that rise up and are then noticed by the state, then the state will actually like decide to put more attention onto the area in the place. Like they won't try to perpetuate the propaganda that, oh my god, all the police are actually doing a good job in this area, you know. So then they'll actually put more effort into making the area the high crime neighborhood low crime neighborhood, instead of just letting it fester. So okay. So what we have done better in this debate is that we trade off violence, and violence isn't necessarily a problem when you look into status quo. So violence is so our conclusion is that violence is necessary, and violence does solve the root issue. That's all. Thank you.
I think the speaker for the speech calling on the deputy leader of opposition here.
Hi, just checking. Am I visible and audible? All right. Hold on. Okay. Okay, let me get my timer going. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, 3 things in this speech. First of all, I'm starting with my rebuttals against OG. Second, an extension on why this active stance against vigilantism is required. And third, how does OO effectively mitigate any of these harms presented by Gov? Let's talk about the claims that OG has brought up. First, they say the current legal system state is already bad and flimsy, and the way they procure this change is through education, right? Notice panel, both of these claims are contingent on the premise that these vigilante groups are only going to like provide safety in the long run, and second, the legal system is impenetrable to any form of change, right? Okay, this is untrue because Ryan already tells you that there are mechanisms when people voice out their concerns towards the legal system, right? What does this look like? This looks like the implementation of body cams. This looks like the implementation of better measures to protect minorities, right? This is like practical change that can only exist on site OO that OG completely disregards. Second, notice their burden is to prove why vigilantism is the sole method of solvency to end this wide-scale violence in their area. But they know it's a losing case. That's why they bring up education and protesting against like school shootings. However, they did not like prove their burden or give any sufficient analysis why like these groups are heavily needed, right? What is the guaranteeing factor that these groups are only going to bring, like they're going to bring these states to the finish line of peace, and that it's not going to come with any bad repercussions at all. So I think with that, I've already sufficiently taken out OG. Now I'm going to go to my extension on what Ryan has already told you. What does OO tell you? We tell you, one, the existence of these groups actively worsens the already fragile state of these legal systems, right? And what the impacts are threefold on this. One, the moment you choose to participate or to support these groups, right, you tangibly propel this message to the world that we need to antagonize our current legal systems. This sends out a wide-scale message, not only within your state, but internationally as well, where you say the current state of your legal system is so bad, where our solution is actually to procure more violence instead of solving the violence that already exists. The second impact lies in the incentive, right? Because if we are discussing the incentives of the people on the ground, the people who are already suffering at the hands of these very, very bad crime rates, you clearly have suffered enough and you want to see tangible change happen. It makes more sense for the incentive and the push be allocated towards the reformation of these of these bad and corrupt legal systems, right? This looks like active protesting and active reaching out to the people who work in these legal systems to procure that change. It makes no logical sense at all for these individuals to actively choose and continuously desire to put themselves through more violence, through more harms in order to reach this state of peace that is not even guaranteed in the end, right? The third impact of this lies in the comparative, because Ryan already tells you that there needs to be a standard of accountability, there needs to be a standard of acknowledgement towards those in power, right? And this ties back to the first impact. It's the message you send out to these systems. We don't have these, when you send out that message, these systems feel we don't have to worry about these people because the people are going to take care of themselves. Let's be charitable and assume a pressure towards these existing systems don't work, right? The impacts are still worse in CG's world, because what happens? One, when you have the existence of groups like the Bakassi Boys, this inherently worsens the image of your state or your country, right? Why? Because automatically, where people are going to automatically believe and automatically associate your country with a place of violence, right? A place that cannot resolve things in a peaceful manner. Second, this creates a cyclical impact on two levels. One, you have a large influx of people wanting to flee their country or flee Detroit or whatever, right? Because it's already been cemented through this choice of supporting vigilantism that these places are always going to be bad, they're always going to be dangerous. You deter the citizens who have already grown up there from actually living there. Thus, they choose to immigrate to other countries. They choose to immigrate to other states to escape the current badness, right? And second, you have the second impact is you have the people who are left in those very bad states. They have to now suffer at the hands of vigilantism because they know there's no other alternative push. There's no other alternative method in changing the legal system that doesn't want to protect them. So what are the harms that could materialize when you choose to be against vigilantism? There's two here. One, the sole reliance on protection is now on an unreliable legal system. Second, the perpetuation of continuous harm upon the people on the ground. Notice how OG does not ever provide a form of mitigation for this, but I'll tell you how we solve it on OO and why it happens worse on SideCov, right? One, on reliance. Notice how the likelihood of harm and violence surging happens worse in Gov's world, because let's take them at their best. Sure, these vigilante groups are successful and they manage to take down all of the bad perpetrators existing in their land, right? Notice how now there's going to be a rise of monopolization in power because vigilantism groups are now saying to the public, you owe your safety to us. We are on the side of the people. If you act against us, there will be repercussions. Notice how this is completely unmitigated by OG at all, but this impact can never materialize on side OO because the legal system's entire existence is already reliant on that premise of protecting people, right? That you as a cop, you as a firefighter, your job is we need to protect the public, right? The moment that premise is claimed by a vigilante group and not appointed as to onto the current legal system, there's going to be an uprise of violence and an uprise of monopolization because you have no checks and balances to guarantee that these vigilante groups are going to work in the favor of the people rather in the favor of themselves, right? So panel, stand with the people, stand with protection of people on the ground, and stand with side OO. Thank you.
I think the speaker for that speech, calling on the member of government, you're here.
Check, am I audible and visible? Let me set up my timer. Pronouns verbally, POI speaking. In the face of an unsolvable problem and systems that simply cannot be accessed, the only thing OO provides us is a hope that the system can be accessed without providing us any structural reasons as to why we should resort to that system. I want to do a few things in my speech. Firstly, to rebut the OO comparative on the principle basis. They say that law does not permit people to take things into their own hands. But I would like to note, this principle only works under the assumption that these systems can be accessed. If they can't, and you live in a lawless state, which is oftentimes where these vigilante groups arise, then the only goal of that lawless state is to return to a state of lawfulness as fast as possible. And to that end, we think any means necessary should be done to return to that lawful state because those systems that they talk about can't be accessed. We also say to counter this, right, that the right to self-defense still exists, and that's why we principally outweigh from OO. OO. Because if a society, if you know that you're going to go out and your family member is going to be harmed, or you are going to be harmed in some way or another, you should be able to preemptively defend yourself by forming an organized group that not only acts as a deterrence, but acts as a signaling force that you can be supported and will be protected in the event that criminals are going to harm you and all that, right? So I also find like to note the characterization of who joins these groups. It isn't just people who are definitively lawless, it's people who have been done harm by, right? So if your family member has died, you're likely to join this group. If you feel that you're in such a bad emotional state that you cannot continue life normally in these areas, you join these groups. That does constitute a principal right to self-defense, and we think that principal extension works for our side. But second thing to rebut here is the idea that the escalation of violence is something that is inherently bad. But firstly, on burdens and on framing, right? OO wanted to like prove that escalation of violence causes more harms and therefore our side is worse than status quo. But this burden is not enough for OO to win the debate, because if you're already in an area with high crime, you're already experiencing so much suffering that any marginal increase in suffering oftentimes doesn't result in a tipping point version of harm. And any marginal increase in violence doesn't change the way we think of these things. And despite all the best efforts of second speaker from OO to try to paint like the image of these areas are already bad, this image will get worse, the increase in bad imagery doesn't happen. In fact, I think the area is likely perceived well because people are thinking of taking things into their own hand and actually working to solve the crime. The comparative is just an area with bad crime. No one is going to invest in the area anyway. They had to prove why they were so likely. The extension will give you, however, is that while OG told you that escalation of violence creates media attention, which is an external mechanization for solving the problem, we will provide you an internal mechanization of escalation of violence on how it results to solvency of the problem at hand. No, thank you. And the extension here is fear. Criminals will fear a vigilante group more than a police force. I think OO conceded this. Why? Because there is a higher capacity to violence and they're also subject to less red tape. This means there is a stronger deterrence force on our side. And how do you weigh this? I think our side is able to reach a tipping point insofar as the burden is to just prove that we're able to create a society better than status quo, because for the long run as well. We win this on 3 grounds. One, not all crime in those areas and high crime areas are organized crime, right? So those unorganized crime doesn't have the capacity to escalate violence. You can't tell your fellow criminals to like be harsher when you stab people. That's not the case. Oftentimes those things are like done because of structural reasons, right? So the escalation of crime by criminals itself is like very little and probably won't happen. But secondly, the police and law enforcement will always prioritize attacking criminals before they attack the vigilante group, which means insofar as the vigilante group like escalates like what their efforts are doing, they're able to better clamp down on criminals and make sure the criminal force is not strong enough. And thirdly, the knowledge that we will experience a lot of harm if you commit a crime makes the benefits of committing that crime far less important than the harm you experience. Because if the harm is you getting stabbed by a vigilante, you will not commit that crime in the first place. And I don't think that will happen then on their side. Before I move on, I'll take a POI. I'm not saying their incentives are better than police force. I'm just saying that they're going to stop crime. And if insofar as they stop crime, you return to a state of lawfulness, which means the systems like police force and court systems, you can actually use those systems, right? Because vigilante groups don't bribe police because they want the crime to be stopped, and police forces are actively going against criminals. The whole purpose of vigilante groups is to stop those problems. If you're trying to push towards that vigilante groups will not do that, that is not a vigilante group. I don't know what that is. They finally tried to say that a police force can work. Principally untrue. Again, the long-term solution on our side is that these vigilante groups will be useless as soon as crime is useless. Because again, these groups have strong like underpinnings, have strong moral values from the characterization we get from OO themselves. As soon as crime is lower, there's no incentive for these groups to escalate efforts given that the problem is less. They're likely to restore power to the police force insofar as bribery happens less, and they're likely to let the situation handle itself. I think get more long-term solvency on our side. Finally, I'll provide you to an extension on why you're able to get justice for individuals on our side. The framing here is crucial. OG only gave you an analysis on material benefits and OOOC only engaged on material benefits, right? We will provide you emotional benefits. How do you weigh this? I think our emotional benefits are more important for a few reasons. One, they're immediate. They're not dependent on whether you solve crime or not. They're immediate. Two, they're not circumstantial. They're also not based on other external factors. Let's say any individual can access these emotional benefits. What are these emotional benefits? I think oftentimes areas in high crime areas have a lot of emotional duress on individuals, right? You fear for your life. This causes a lot of hopelessness and uncertainty. All of this skews your thinking. You're only thinking in the short term. So you don't have children. You don't think about buying a house in these areas. Your life is principally interrupted. And you oftentimes cannot access many of the things normal people enjoy, which is why your situation is so bad. This only hopelessness is such a bad harm, and we prove to you why it is such bad harm. How are we able to solve this then on our side? One, I think the moment you have vigilante groups, you take things into your own hand. Remember who joins these vigilante groups. People who have been done who people have like had harm done to them, or people who feel such a desperate need to join a vigilante group because they think their life cannot be continued on in the current state and they cannot trust law enforcement. But secondly, you also opt out of other, like you also are a part of a like-minded group, right? You're a part of individuals in your group who are sharing the same incentive to stop crime, sharing the same experiences as you, and sharing the same like opposition to the crime organizations. So that in of itself gives you emotional benefits. You're a part of a place where you know you're protected and you know that people are actually doing things to help save the situation. That gives you a lot of hope, that makes you feel good, that makes you have hope in the future, that does things like encourage you to have children, encourage you to start up businesses, because those things are existing. So what are the impacts of this? I think one, you're able to create positive momentum shifts. You give people in these areas hope. So even if this results in coercion, we tell you opposition psychological harms are much worse than coercion, because the psychological harms on opposition are ones of hopelessness, which doesn't even allow you to do things. At least coercion leads to a positive benefit, and a positive benefit in your mental well-being. But secondly, given that change is very hard, at least on our side, you give emotional reparations to individuals in these areas. Because the moment you opt into this group, you feel that you're a part of something, and the rhetoric, the religious rhetoric, or whatever rhetoric they use in these groups also drives you to feel good and do good things, and that is simply an emotional benefit. Insofar as the burden on both sides is to prove that you're able to increase the happiness of these areas and increase the mental well-being of individuals in these areas, I think our side is able to solve it best, and our side is able to solve it faster. The moment you don't put your trust fully into a police force that you cannot control, you put trust into your own hands, which just gives you much more of a sense of autonomy and much more of a sense of freedom. For all those reasons, this is a CG win.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Calling on the member of opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible? Okay. Okay. Just because a system is broken, it doesn't mean that you have to break it further, right? We think the solution on site closing opposition isn't to create opportunities for more crimes to occur, for more crimes to happen, right? As much as they're corrupt, as much as these governments are very corrupt and these governments are lacking in their ability, we think that vigilantism backfires because they don't know how to fight in and of itself, right? They try to, they try to kill these people, but they get hurt themselves while hurting the process of the authorities in the very first place. This is something that we want to avoid as much as possible, site closing opposition. We think that the houses in so far has been very ineffective because opening government has generally been very unrealistic. Opening opposition has focused too much on a negative case, and we will deal with a site closing government. So what we're gonna talk about in this speech, we think that we're gonna first say on some extension. First of all, we're gonna say how these vigilante groups, they will undermine the authority of the government in and of itself, because we think that the unregulated violence and chaos will hurt the process of the authorities in the first place, because vigilantism stems from the idea that the government isn't doing enough, that they're unable to do something. But this characterization has been a deadlock in the first half of this debate, right? For example, we talk about how opening government talk about how these vigilante groups are very passionate, and the middle government talk about how they're past victims and they want to resolve these and they want to help these victims in the first place. No, thank you. But we think that these vigilante groups, they just want to be authoritative. For example, the vigilante groups in Nigeria, right? They just want to take matters into their own hands, and they just want to cause more violence because they can do so from this government, right? But we think that these vigilante groups, they stem from the idea that the government isn't doing enough, and that they're unable, right? But we think that but side government's characterization is wrong, because these vigilante groups, they wouldn't take action to criminals if they think that the government is doing enough, if they are just passionate for a movement and they're just passionate for a social movement, right? But we think that this is bad because a state cannot function without cooperation from the state and the people. So this automatically clashes with open government's mechanism, which is very short term. The mechanism, no thank you, is the fact that the vigilante violence will result in protests, which will result in the state taking action. But we think that the state is unable to do anything if they don't get cooperation of the people. They get more riled up and they just have more misunderstandings and miscommunications. Right? For example, if a protest is going on, all the state can do is just fight and just retaliate with more force and more oppression. Right? We think that this just results in more violence in the very at the end of the day, and everyone will become very irrational and very emotional, and no one will listen to each other. We think this is an outcome that we do not want from side opposition. We think that this is also very short termist, right? But on the long term, we think that it makes it hard for the government then to push policies and laws, even if they want to reform the police system and the high crime rates in this area, because there's just so much opposition and there's so much reliance on this vigilante group. Right? This is an outcome that from side opposition. Right? Yes, Althea.
Yeah, if vigilante groups only arise in a state where law is so hard to be enforced and polices are bribed, what is the exact mechanization on how you can conclusively get a better law enforcement to crack down on criminal groups on your side?
Exactly, right. So we will use these resources in order to, fund the police even more and stuff like that. But we also told you why, even in your best case scenario, even if these governments are so bad that these vigilante groups have to step up, we think this is so much. It's so much better for these police to just get better and improve in the long run, rather than having more chaos that will undermine the authority of the government and will undermine the process in general. So opening government keeps telling us that the trade-off of violence is okay, but we already told you that we're telling you now that violence is wrong because it can spiral very fast and it's hard to control violence in the first place. So the solution is not to fight violence with more violence. It's not something that you should support in any circumstance, because if you want to protect the vulnerable individuals who get hurt in the process, then you should side with side closing opposition, right? Because the opening government proposes a solution that hurts so many innocent and vulnerable civilians, and it's not a legitimate trade-off. So we think that the state reputation will go down and the people will be affected. But then they also told us about how there's discourse and discussions on social media that negative discussion is better than having none at all. But we think that this will just create more anger. This will rile up the people, which will undermine the authority of the government even more, which will not cause any legitimate change in the future. But they also never mechanize on how this is even effective in the first place, if there's any value to this discussion and discourses, because we think that it will just cause disillusionment on the government, right? We think that it's also not mutually exclusive for their side, because this undermines the truth of crimes, because social media is a catalyst for fake news, and it's more injustice in the long run, right? So next we talk about our extension on how we get more closure for victims, which is not been talked about in this debate, right? We think if we take them at the best, that the police system is so bad that only vigilante groups can do effective stuff, right? We think that our side is still better for the closure of victims, because for example, the police or the legal system, right, their job is to investigate the truth of the case and bring justice and get closure, and that people are innocent until they're proven guilty. We think that this is so much better than vigilante groups, for example, where they get temporarily where they give temporary satisfaction and closure to the victims. If you just record a video of you slapping the criminal, or you just behead the criminal, right? We think that ultimately this debate is about who can protect the innocent people on the ground. As much as we talk about changes in systems on the top, it's those who are at the bottom who are affected. So opening opposition also never talked about the victims and the closure for victims, but we get that best on our side, because we get to actually find out about the truth and then lock these people up, because we give them what actually happened, and they can actually have a peace of mind, and this will undo years of therapy under our side. So we also talk about side closing government also talk about deterrence, right, on how they will have lower crime rates because they can restore, and in the future they can restore power to the police force, and they talk about emotional benefits. But we think that all vigilante groups will do under side government is instill fear amongst the people, that they will just make people fear them, and they will just run around making people fear them. And we don't think that this is very beneficial, especially since we don't want the public to fear the people in authority, but we want the public to work with the people in authority. So all in all, we think that even if the government is not even if the government is not doing as well, we think that it's still important that we have have some trust in the government, and we still allow the people to have some faith, because if we instill fear on the people, then they will not do anything. That never been part of true occurrence.
I thank the speaker for that speech, calling on the government with here.
Alright, just give me a few seconds to set up my timer. Hi, am I audible and visible? Okay, I assume I am. In areas of extreme crime, continuing a failed and corrupt system is the worst harm you could place on these individuals. Before we went on clash, just a few strategic observations. Firstly, just note the huge amount of contradictions in opening up. Because firstly, they can't say that the police are sufficient enough to do their job and put people in jail, but in the same breath say that the only vigilante groups can scare the mafia and the police does not, and therefore the same retaliation won't occur. But secondly, they also can't say that we have no funding and we can't actually catch people, but in the same breath say that suddenly we're going to kill everyone and cause so much fear and retaliation from the mafia. So they can't have their cake and eat it. So what do we actually support? We think there is some propensity for harm, but we will mitigate the large atrocities coming from offers. But secondly, even in our worst case, even if we do kill some people, we think it's justified, firstly, because for the crime the criminals committed in the first place, but secondly, to prevent any future killings that these people would have otherwise caused if they were not caught. But lastly, I don't think their counter model works because they can't support defunding the police because they have to prove where they get the money from. They don't actually have fiat in this debate because our side isn't funding these groups. We allow these groups to mobilize amongst themselves. They have to prove where they get the money from. So first clash then on the characterization battle, before second about effectiveness, and lastly on our extension. So the first about the characterization battle about what status quo actually looks like. We get it from Ob is that there is some form of accountability. We do have body cams and the bribing is not that pervasive. I'll settle this right now. 3 responses. Firstly, the police are the people that is most likely to be susceptible to bribes from the mafia and organized crime because their motivation to solve crime is just to get money because it's their job, right? So if another group can then offer them more money, then they will be bribed, and these groups are the mafia and the organized crime. On the other hand, these vigilante groups' motivation is to get justice for the victims that have been wronged, get justice for their brother that has been killed by random criminals, right? But secondly, the examples they use is just unstrategic because for every example they can bring about how black people got justice via the court, the hundreds and thousands of black individuals that get ignored and oppressed under the police brutality because the police have the power and the ability to control their body cams and what it shows in court and force their colleagues to lie on the stand. But lastly, acting on biases is symmetric because we already see this in the amount of police brutality in the world. But in our case, it's actually less because if those people that join these groups are those that have been wronged, they are unlikely to be biased against the community that have been previously wronged. So, for example, if the black people suffered from a lack of police involvement in this high crime area and whoever committed crimes on them got away, these black people will join the vigilante groups, and obviously they won't cause even more harm to their own black community. So the conclusion of this is that most of the harms that art brings to us is symmetric to the corrupt police system. And CO's 30 seconds extension then about closure is just out of this debate because it relies on police being effective in the first place. And therefore, we also prove there is an impetus to get vigilante groups because the current state is just so bad. So secondly, then on effectiveness. So the main contentious part here is that Ops is that these people are too unregulated and therefore they will cause so much harm. I have 6 responses here. I think firstly, the reason why these individuals joined a vigilante group was because society has wronged them and they feel a need to get justice. So they want to fight back and they clearly want to separate themselves from that criminality because they don't want to stoop so low because this is they stand against these criminals doing harm in the first place. So they're unlikely to just shoot everyone and cause everyone to die, right? But secondly, there are external checks and balances. Media organizations, human rights groups, they're likely to put up bad media attention if they really do bad things, right? So obviously these vigilantes can't just bomb a bridge on their side of the house. But thirdly, even if they really do super illegal stuff themselves, I think they are probably going to get arrested, right? Because if we see people bombing a bridge, if it's so harmful, like federal officials are probably going to step in, things like the FBI and things like that. But fourthly, some people within the group may be optimistic and they may want them to go to jail. So what they do is that they follow legal procedures so that the process is legitimate and evidence can be collected in a correct way so that these people can actually be convicted in court because if they believe in the system, right? But fifth, this vigilante group isn't a one-man team. There's lots of other people within the group that can act as a check and balances for a random rogue man. So it's highly likely that at least one person will have a moral compass and will say that no, bombing a bridge is bad, no, killing all these people is bad. But lastly, it doesn't really matter if you undermine police authority because status quo is one where the police aren't doing anything in the first place. They don't even have resources to fight the crime. So there is nothing that is being undermined by the vigilante groups. So this is important in the round because it proves that the harms of vigilante groups isn't that large as Op tries to pin it to be. So since status quo is already so bad, the marginal increase is not really that important in the round because at least we were better able to place some resources into just fighting crime and gaining justice for the most vulnerable people. Whereas on your side, the police is spread too thin and they don't even crack down on crime. And no, you still have to give mechanization as to how things get better on your side. I think it's already too late in whip. But lastly, I want to flip this. So even in our really worst case, where the perception of harm is so large, and on Op's best case, where the police is not corrupt, we told you that these vigilante groups were still better because they were scarier than any organized police force, and they already conceded this. I don't actually see why fear is bad, because then we can deter crime from happening in the first place. We can deter criminals from just doing whatever they do in the first place. So I think the conclusion is we engage far more charitably, and we already beat both our benches. So what was our extension then, and why was it the most important thing in the round? Not the lack of engagement from CO, right? This was important in the round because it's not contingent on these vigilante groups doing it in a good or bad way, or whether they actually catch the criminal or whether they don't catch the criminal, right? This extension was important because it occurred in areas where those people that joined the vigilante groups have felt wrong. These are the people that had their parents or their brother murdered, and therefore they're chasing justice on their behalf. They're better able to take things into their own hands rather than just waiting for the police to do whatever. The chase, putting in the effort day in and day out, is a form of catharsis and self-actualization, that you're putting in the work because you want change to happen. Before I move on, I'll take a point actually. I think firstly, I'm unlikely why white people are going to engage in this, because we told you that the characterization is that those that have been wronged by the police system and those that had crimes that weren't being solved. But secondly, for every George Floyd example, there's thousands of people that have suffered police brutality and never got their day in court, that never got a chance for legal accountability, just because the power that the police has is so large. So our extension was that even those that were incapable of getting justice, so let's say they don't have the resources to join the vigilante groups, it was also good for them because they know that there is actually a group out there looking out for you. They are better able to be optimistic and hopeful that their crime will be solved, or just at the very least, they know what happened to their dead brother, right? What's the impact and weighing in this round? This was more important than anything OG ran, because we allowed people to actually grieve, to move on, and to continue with their life, to find out what really happened to your family member. Did they die by drowning, or was there foul play involved? You no longer resent the police and just push blame onto them, because this doesn't actually help your grieving process at all. And this is something OP has to defend. So we already went on certainty because it's not contingent on any outcome. The chase of justice was enough to bring people satisfaction and just peel compared to the nebulous and speculative burden of confirm getting the criminal on their side. So for all those reasons, propose.
I think the speaker for that speech calling on the opposition whip to conclude this debate here.
Sorry, give me a second to organize my notes. I feel like one of my notes. Thank you. Oh, okay. I'm going to begin this debate is firstly, I'm going to talk about like government against opposition, and secondly, I'm going to talk about why we weigh over our opening side. Number one, government against opposition, right? So there's two key ideas here. Number one, the effectiveness of vigilantes in serving justice on two metrics, which is deterrence and proportional punishment. And number two will be like social reforms, which side will better achieve social reforms in their society. So let's talk about the effectiveness of vigilantes in serving justice, right? Now, OG has brought this idea of like perception of crimes. So then this means that like they achieve deterrence because people are scared to get like attacked or like punished by these vigilante groups. And how has OO responded to this? They say that deterrence is actually better achieved on their side because of like authority that is like more prominent in the government, and there's no real justice actually being served in government side because of the value of punishment being distorted by the lack of legal processes and truth. How now I'm going to talk about like why we go and expand on the value of justice and why we think like our impact is more important, right? So then when there's a lack of like legal processes and truth, we think that like there's like some like further injustice in the long term, right? There's going to be like a mess of like the criminal cases, right, and a mess of like how justice is going to be served. And in the long run, there's actually no real reform because like it's a lot messier for the government to go and deal with these things. And we think that like that's so important in this debate, right? Because like in the long term, right, we almost see these groups just continuing to arise, right, without the regulation that is needed to go and like ensure like hey, this punishment is actually proportional and this punishment is like true to what the crime has been committed, right? But government also talked about how like because these vigilante groups can actually serve punishment in place of the government, right? Again, like we tell you, on the extension of like proportionality that OO hasn't actually brought out, at least like not sufficiently, right? So proportionality would be like smoking means like a fine, whereas like murder would be like a sentence in jail, so on and so forth. We think this is important, right? Because it highlights the value and severity of like certain crimes. It highlights like smoking is not equal to murder. It highlights the fact that like there's going to be like justice that's brought there's going to be more punishment that's brought to like crimes that are worse. And we think like because vigilante groups are like unregulated, right, because of like this illusion of government, so they're not likely to work with the government in the first place. What happens then is that when like vigilante groups go and serve unproportional crimes, they go and like murder people for like smoking in public areas. We think that number one, there's going to be fear amongst people, and it's not going to look like justice, but rather like oppression or like violence that is like unregulated and uncontrolled.
Yeah,
in our
right.
society. Later, sir. And then number two, people are going to face like emotional turmoil. They're scared to do anything. They're scared to like do things that they enjoy anymore. And like there's going to be disillusionment in like morality and values. And we think there's going to be like an onset of like pessimism that occurs in society. So then what happens is like when there's like pessimism in society, right? We think like people are going to be very like emotionally distressed. We think that like there's no like a sense of hope in people anymore. And we think that's quite important for like justice anyway. Can I take that POI?
Yeah, given there's a natural incentive for these groups to like become smaller the moment the police force becomes bigger, why is it the case that it'll become messier for the police to resolve crime, given that police naturally target criminals and not vigilantes?
Okay, we think like police the police force is already like not going to like be very effective in the first place, right? And we think that's that's a characterization that we have to concede. But then we think that when we use vigilante groups as like a means to go and serve justice, we think justice is not proportionally served, and we think this justice has like little to no value, or rather even negative value, because they don't actually they don't serve justice in the light of truth. We think that's important. And we think like continuing my speech, awareness isn't like mutually exclusive to them as well, right? Because needs social media discourse can happen and occur without vigilantes anyway, so that defeats the point of like open awareness. But we think that like what happens then is easier for us to get international support as well, which is why which is what we're going to like which is what I'm going to expand on later on. I'm going to talk about why we way over our opening slide, right? So what has my previous speaker put? She brought out a few extensions. Number one, undermining authority of government. So then this means like a lack of regulation and a disillusionment in like government authority. Number two, like because of protests and vigilante groups occurring at the same time, right? We think that government has to deal with more things at once, and we think it's harder for social reform to occur even if like the government wanted to reform their systems and whatnot. So number three, there's like a closure for the victim. And why we think we're better than opening on three metrics, right? Number one is the emotional impact. We tell you closure is important in this debate because we think that is a catalyst or like a kickstart to have for people to have faith in these governments and laws, right? And it's an opportunity for governments to like go and reform in the first place, because realize the government side never gives an opportunity for like our government to reform and change their policies, because they influence because there's like political instability that they have to deal with. We think like nationalistic ideals are going to be important in this debate today, because we think like this is more important to have nationalism in crisis in and with the like rise of unity as well. And I'm gonna explain why, even if our government is correct, it's important to have these things. But number two, right, because of the belief in morality, that's why we win over the impacts than opening. So I'm gonna talk about like justice and government reform, right? The national ideals are going to be good because like there's not going to be protests and whatnot, right? But even if like governments are corrupt, it's so far that like our side gets like awareness on social media as well, right? It's easier for us to welcome international support because international governments don't have to be deterred by the idea of conflict with other nations. Number two, it deals directly with food issues like money, aid, food, and medicine. And we think that's going to lower those crime rates because it deals with the root problem. And with that, I'm so proud to side with CO. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for that speech. That concludes the debate. Please virtually cross floors. Please wait in this room. I will be back in about 15 minutes to deliver the results. Thank you for the debate.
Thanks for the debate.
Thanks for the debate, guys.